Hello, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Lisa Tim, and the manager of PRC Saltillo Training and Implementation. We are here with Julie Gatts, and we are honored to host the SGD Has Shipped, Now What? Supporting adults with aphasia using AAC in recognition of Aphasia Awareness Month. I will turn this over to Julie, and she will get started with the presentation. Thank you, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Lisa. I'm really excited to be here. I have been a clinical educator at the University of Kansas since 1996, with a brief excursion back into healthcare from 2012 to 2016. Working with adults with aphasia has been a lifelong passion of mine, and for the last 20 years, that has increasingly included use of AAC. I believe that just about any person with aphasia can benefit from the use of modalities, and one with a voice is more meaningful. I feel like most of us accept the use of AAC for individuals with dysarthria, especially those without any linguistic or cognitive impairment. But in my experience, there are so many folks with aphasia who I believe could benefit from high-tech AAC who don't have it. There is more research coming out related to AAC and acquired disorders, but I readily admit that it is slow in coming and it's really hard to find right now. Medicare began funding AAC systems in 2001. Russo and colleagues in 2017 published a systematic review of high-tech AAC for adults with post-stroke aphasia. In it, they looked at 22 observational studies and 8 case reports. There were no controlled studies to look at. The studies included individuals with non-fluent aphasia, fluent, and global aphasia, and a few indicated the presence of apraxia of speech. Those ranged from 1997 to 2015. They concluded that AAC systems may be a useful tool to improve communication and social participation. However, practical application of AAC intervention are still in the development stage. So really, we don't have any solid information on how to teach use yet. We're hoping that that's going to keep coming, and we have to use our clinical skills to guide us at this point. So I love this quote: "Every person, regardless of the severity of his or her disabilities, has the right to communicate with others, express everyday preferences, and exercise at least some control over his or her daily life. Each individual, therefore, should be given the chance, training, technology, respect, and encouragement to do so." Bob Williams, the former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary, who is an AAC user. And I think we need to keep this in mind for people with aphasia. At what point does someone's frequency or perceived importance of communication justify the expense of an SGD? What if they can express with a voice their preference once a day? Is it worth it? And I would challenge you to consider the value of communicating. For me, it would be my favorite food, but maybe if you want a hug or even some other basic idea, and the ability to communicate that and how valuable that is, even if it only happens once a day or once a week. So I would say yes, the expense is worth it. This is just a cloud with lots of the terms that I associate with AAC and people with aphasia. This is a quote that I heard in a teaching summit that not at all related to AAC or even speech pathology, but it really has struck me and I use it quite a bit. You have to internalize language so you begin to think in that language. This is so important and brings home why it's critical to get everyone using the AAC system and all modalities, everyone who is in that person's circle who we're working with. So some of the barriers, and there are many, I'm really going to focus on the professional-based barriers in this presentation and in the next few slides. So I'm not going to go through the rest, but they are on this slide if you want to see them. Jean Johnson and her colleagues in 2019, just recently, did a survey of SLPs looking at the factors that they perceived influencing success versus abandonment of AAC. And they found that SLPs reported that the following factors were most important: not maintaining, adjusting the system, attitude, lack of training, lack of support, and poor fit. Those are all the most frequent cause of abandonment by the SLP's perception. I'd be interested to see, and this is not specific to people with aphasia, but just in general. Most of these areas can be directly related to clinician variables at some level. And the recommendations that arose from this survey were to implement systematic intervention targeting these areas. So that's kind of what this presentation is going to be about. these are the variables, some of the variables that we have under our control, and these are the ones that I wanted to highlight. Some of them have more detail than others, but I think it's really important to increase the knowledge of hardware, software, and getting comfortable teaching use of a device or of a system. And that's an ongoing process. The technology is always changing. Fortunately, it doesn't change drastically. It does over time, but in small increments. So, and again, these are variables related to us as professionals and the things we need to be comfortable with and be doing. It's important that we're collaborative rather than directive, that we have knowledge of the hardware and software systems, have a knowledge of the users within the software systems, do the pages within those users transfer to other sets, etc. Have knowledge of concepts associated with aphasia and motor learning, because that is a whole different ballgame. I would never profess to be able to go in and work with an individual with autism or a child using AAC, because my area of expertise is with aphasia and I understand aphasia. So we have to have that. Having knowledge of teaching strategies associated with AAC. I am so sorry. This is one of the drawbacks of working from home. So I'm going to keep going. I apologize for my dog. We have to be flexible in our thinking and problem solving. We have to presume competence. An example that I like to use, when I was younger, I rode horses. I had a trainer who trained my horse and then worked with me. And one night I was riding my horse in the arena and I was trying to get her to take certain lead, so start off with a certain leg when going into a canter. The trainer, who was also a close friend and like a brother, got on me pretty hard for not putting my leg into her. And through tears, I stated I was putting my leg into her. And I said, "How do you know I'm not doing it?" He said, "Because if you were giving her what she needed, she would be going into the lead." So I kind of take this and apply it for all aspects of what I do, but particularly for AAC. If I'm providing the support that someone needs, they're going to be able to learn the device. And that support can be through their communication partners, through them, and through their community. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time with this, but the continuum of communication independence, the emergent, context-dependent, and independent communicators, the level of communicator is going to drive how you teach and what the expectations are. So for an emergent communicator, this is somebody who does not have a reliable method of expressive communication through symbolic language. High-tech is not appropriate for all individuals who are emergent communicators, but I feel like the potential for high-tech to be more effective than low or no-tech is pretty high. If you think about the fact that this gives somebody a voice and helps them make those associations, they have the visual representation and the auditory. Historically, these are the groups that, or this is the group that we have thought are not appropriate for high-tech AAC, and I would disagree with that in general. So a context-dependent communicator is somebody who has symbolic communication that's reliable, but it's limited to particular contexts or partners. And this is somebody who might need help getting to the page, but when they're on the page, they can find the right information, or they might just need a little bit of support finding that information. So this person still needs support and is dependent on a communication partner, at least at times, but maybe not as much, for sure not as much so as the emergent communicator. The emergent communicator is dependent pretty much all the time for somebody to help them get to what they need. The independent communicator is has the ability to communicate anything on any topic to anyone in any context. And these usually are people who don't have language and cognitive impairment. They're often text-based. But I will say that I've seen many people with a pretty pure Broca's aphasia who were pretty darn independent on devices when I use icons paired with text and combining a keyboard and word prediction at times. So they're able to use all of those modalities within the device. So the keys to success, we need to do three primary things. We need to educate communication partners to support the use of AAC or SGD, speech generating devices, by the person with aphasia. We need to individualize the system and know that the individualization is dynamic. It needs to change. We make mistakes with layout at times. The person's language continues to change, and we need to adapt to that. We need to provide content for and experiences in natural contexts. So education for a person with aphasia, we really have no formal research on communication partner training for individuals with aphasia who are using AAC right now. We do know that communication partner training works with partners of children and adults with developmental disabilities who use AAC. We also know that communication partner training works with partners of people with aphasia in things like supported communication and just increasing functional communication. We also have our own clinical experience. Education needs to be integrated over time. Initially, I try to prioritize expectations, participation, and facilitation of the use of device. And I'll get to those here in a minute. But some of the overarching concepts that I think are important when we think about educating people related to AAC, and again, this is communication partner and the person with aphasia. It needs to be integrated with intervention. It needs to incorporate each component within each session, so it needs to happen repeatedly in the sessions. It needs to begin prior to the receipt of the system, and that might mean that you need to have the app or at least hard copy pages to begin that process. Intensity is high and decreases over time, and it's long-term. And I know, having been in healthcare recently, I know that those two things are issues. And I am a Medicare provider currently, and I do know that those are issues. And I can answer any questions later about some ideas on how to get around that. And we need to transition our role from interventionist to consultant, which is really one of the reasons we critically need to involve the communication partners. So this graphic represents some of the components I've found to be important. Education on aphasia may include the intended use. This gets at expectations. What are the expectations? Oftentimes I run into families and people who think, oh, we're going to give them this computer and they're going to be able to communicate. And we need to make sure they understand that that's not going to be the case, that it's a process. What contexts are priorities? Because we want to focus there. The expectations in terms of independence. So going back to that emergent, context-dependent, and independent communicators, and where we see that person now, and kind of anticipating that that road. The purposefulness of the system in the long term is to increase participation, and that needs to be an understood expectation from my perspective. So then we need to provide education on the device itself, the hardware, the machine. You have to judge how tech savvy your user is to know how deep to go with that. The software setup, so the user in general, the content of the user, and the fact that it's dynamic. It needs to be useful, it can be individualized and needs to be individualized. The role of the communication partner is an area for education. What's expected of them to help the person with aphasia use that system for participation? They'll need to know they'll need to know the user system. Going back to that quote, we must internalize language in order to use it. And that goes for everyone using the device and supporting the device. And we need to reassure them we'll be there to support them and give them other resources as well. We need to educate them on the use of teaching strategies. What are the teaching strategies? Why do we use those teaching strategies? We teach them to use them, and why is it important that they use them at home, even when they might know what someone's trying to communicate? The context for use, the importance of creating opportunities for use needs to be explicitly presented, and a collaborative plan to do so should be developed, and it should be reviewed every week. What are you going to do this week outside of here? Where are you going? How can we incorporate this? Being a care provider is hard. It takes time, energy, and can be all-consuming. I don't know this from experience. I know it from observing other people and from talking to the people who support people with aphasia. I think we all know this, but I think we forget it sometimes. So in terms of expectations, I think just making sure that people understand outcomes, the level of involvement, and the timeline. And this is really a critical part of the educational process. Sometimes a lack of success is because we don't provide enough education on the purpose of a device. It's to augment, it's not to replace communication. What are the targets? What specific situations do they want to be able to have a voice for? And sometimes that's not at home, that's other contexts. Oftentimes at home, they're able to communicate more effectively. And why? We're going to augment and support. We're not going to obtain automatic return of language. And this is, again, as I mentioned before, sometimes this is a common misconception, and I think we need to address this from the start. How will the system be used? Not just for practice, but that is a bonus. Start this at the beginning of intervention and try to look forward. Then throughout intervention, identify specific situations, contexts, and communication events that the device can be incorporated within. These may change and grow over time, and that's appropriate. For the person with aphasia, practice finding things using the system, using it as a voice in addition to their voice, and other modalities in daily use. So using a combination of modalities to help with the process of figuring out where things go on the device and how to use the device. For the communication partner, we want to identify what contexts are important for use, the content associated with that, and collaborate to figure out where things need to go. They often know they always know how the person thinks better than we do. And this is going to include prioritizing content to access easily versus the content that you have to layer through to get to, taking photos, programming, that kind of thing. We need to emphasize the importance of using the device even when they know what the person is wanting to say, especially initially, just so they get familiar with it. Both parties get familiar with it. And then the SLP's role is multifaceted and includes all of these areas along with brainstorming and adding our expertise with language to the conversation. We also need to create activities for practice at home. This is a process, it's not an event. It is like learning a second language as an adult, only harder. It can take years and does, just like learning language does. And some of that is intervention, but a lot of it is outside of intervention and beyond the intervention period. So again, the importance of communication partner training. So Kent Walsh and McNaughton in 2005 created a very systematic partner-based or partner training program that has been effective with kids, and they have implemented this with kids. I'm not going to go through, but you can see that this is very kind of step-by-step. You see what they know to begin with. You teach a strategy by description. You demonstrate the strategy, do verbal practice, then they practice in context. Then you do a post-test and you kind of go back at it again. There's existing videos, and these strategies with children and some young adults are what's in the videos. But we need to develop more for adults with acquired disorders, and particularly aphasia. Ogletree adapted this and used a 7-step version with staff at a residential facility to work with an individual with developmental disorders, and they had good success initially, but as you would expect with staff turnover, that decreased. So what does partner education look like in an intervention session? And the intervention protocol is going to include all of these things listed on this slide. What I want to emphasize is in every session, you need to make sure to check in with the person with aphasia and the communication partner. What might need to be adjusted, what has changed. You brainstorm what is working and what isn't working. We're going to provide ongoing supports and resources. And all of these pieces of the pie are the resources that we need to provide. Sometimes we might need to create short instructional videos for hardware and software settings and programmings. In many cases, these are already online in the companies that sell devices that we fit our folks with aphasia with. So sometimes they're already there, but sometimes you also have to individualize them. You have to create, or one idea is to create a small notebook with visuals in it with step-by-step instructions using screenshots and things like that. Show them how to, and then go to the websites with them to see the instructional resources. So rather than just say, here's a website, I like to go with them in a session. Here's the website, here are what some of the features are, because we're always working, and again, this depends on how tech savvy they are, but we're not always working with folks who are real comfortable online. So we might need to do that with them. Demonstrating contacting tech support to get assistance. If they see us using tech support, then they'll feel more comfortable using it. And I use tech support all the time, so I want them to know that. Again, this is a process. It has to be revisited. It's not a one and done kind of thing. So I'm going to show you a clip. Not going to show you the whole thing because it's pretty long. But this is, and they have given me permission to use their real names. We've done presentations together at our state association, and we've done a poster together at ASHA. So they're very open. But this is a man who has aphasia, and his wife she is an educator. She's had no formal training. This is the first session of a semester, the first semester, maybe the second semester I started working with them, where she's kind of giving instructions to the students, which I love, because she knows how he uses the device.
What do you mean?
Your everyday phrases category.
Oh.
Puck does not read out of context very well. So if he's trying to read a single word on those, it doesn't compute.
Okay.
Do you remember where your sentences are, the phrases that we have on your cards? The same sentences you practice on your cards?
Perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah. But the phrase, everyday phrases, doesn't compute.
Okay.
Maybe.
So sentences
Usually.
is more...
If he's reading...
Just know that kind of what happened was the clinician was asking him about using his device, and the wife was saying, when you use those words, that doesn't really make sense to him. Here are the words that make sense to him when he's using Tabby, and here's the kind of support that he needs. And they named the device Tabby. So again, I apologize that that's not working well. So it's really critical to individualize the user. I created this based on me. So assuming I had a stroke, here are some of the things that are my pre-aphasia participation activities. Here are some things that I'm currently doing, because we know that in my experience, the people who have aphasia end up kind of sitting around watching TV and going to therapy, and joining other people when they're doing social activities sometimes. And so then here are my goals for participation afterward. Sharing my story with students and professionals, walking each day, and if in a wheelchair, having longer roles. Cook one new recipe a week or request favorite recipes. You can see a recurring theme here of food is important to me. Attend church on Sunday and join a Bible study. I'm not currently in a Bible study. I run the soundboard at church, but I might want to get involved in a different way. Talk with my daughters by FaceTime several times a week, watch sports and a few shows, order food on my own. So some of those might require new pages. Some of them might just require the addition of vocabulary or information or messages to current pages that are there. So let's take that. I'm sorry, let me back up here. Just like any other type of intervention, the content, vocabulary, and messages should be centered around what the person will use to increase participation. The preceding slide has my proposed outcomes if I would acquire aphasia, and that's what I just went through, and the process above would be driven by my outcomes. So everything is focused on participation. So setting up the device would be focused on what do I need to do those activities. The messages and the vocabulary would be set up based on that. Teaching within activities, we would want to try to create the activities to mimic what I'm doing, and if possible, getting out in the community. But again, being in healthcare, I know that that's not always a possibility. And then using appropriate context or trying to recreate the context that they might be using them in. And again, this is where collaborating with the communication partner to identify how you can practice this during the week is a help. So some of the concepts for creating the user pages, what do they want to communicate, and prioritize the availability of this. So keep things readily accessible that they're going to use a lot or that they want to get to frequently. You can also do this by practicing getting to it more. But I think you also want to make it so it's easily accessible. You want to talk like they talked. So if somebody, I have a client who, you know, we might have put in his device, hi, how are you? When he normally would say howdy. So we want to put in there howdy. And so just using the kinds of phrasing, the kinds of comments that they would use, not necessarily correct grammar, okay? And including things that allow them to express anger, discomfort, things that might be what we would perceive as inappropriate to express, but we all have that option with a voice, so we want to give that to them. And now again, that's their choice, whether they want that in there. Using the device as a process and not an event. It is not a test, and I think that is so important. It's all right to help them with finding things and saying the things as we go through, you know, showing them where to go, showing them how to get there, and doing that repeatedly. It's not a test. So I like to think about the concept of errorless learning that we use a lot of times with people with brain injury, but I think this is relevant for people with aphasia as well. So the more times they can successfully get to a page, the easier they're going to get to it. I'm that way with a computer. The more times I do something wrong, the harder it is for me to learn to do it right. So I've taught myself, my strategy is to write down the sequence and then go through and practice it several times, especially now that when we moved from work office to home office and having to learn all new access issues from home. So I think this is important to keep in mind with our clients. We're not testing them. It's not a quiz. We want to support them in being able to successfully communicate. One critical thing is we need to understand how they sort, categorize, and think about language. That has changed for almost all of them. And then we need to build on what they have in this area and recognize that that may change over time and probably will change over time. We, in terms of the layout, the layout is either grid or visual scene based. Sometimes, and by layout, I mean, what does a page look like? So sometimes a hybrid is used, and I tend to use hybrids actually quite often anymore. A grid layout is buttons in a row and columns, whereas a visual scene is a photo with either hotspots where you touch on the photo and it says a certain message, or it takes you to a grid of certain messages. Or it could be a picture with comments around it. There's also, you can create hotspots like timelines and maps, where if you touch on, and you'll see an example of that later, where you touch on the state of Kansas and it says Kansas. I happen to be in Kansas, so that's why I use that as an example. Visual scenes provide more context. And we'll talk about later, but activity engaged photos are more helpful than camera engaged photos. So taking pictures of people doing things. Now, you don't necessarily want to use a picture of that for a 1x1 inch button because you can't see the detail of that. But certainly if you can get a bigger visual scene, that's a good layout setup. There's very little research on the combined or hybrid type of user, but experientially, I find it's often easier to fit the individual's needs. Some contexts they need more support, and other contexts they need less. So, and then the type of message generation refers to how the messages are created. Do we use pre-programmed messages where you push a button and it has a sentence or two sentences or a paragraph? Are they organized by category? Are they organized by context? Are they organized alphabetically? You also can have word vocabulary. So instead of a sentence length messages, you might have a single word, and you might have a page of animals or a page of household items. And so those are oftentimes organized semantically by category, and then within them, usually they come alphabetically organized, but I find that for most of our folks with aphasia, that does no good. And so I try to put the things to the top that they use frequently. Are they going to use a word-based vocabulary, a sentence construction, typing? You know, so when you think about creating sentences, I find that that is not very commonly effective for somebody with aphasia. That has not been my experience. But usually having a variety of types of messages can be helpful. Now, for some people, especially the emergent communicators, that may not be that is usually not the case. Okay. So the home page, the additional pages, the number of layers through pages, and the icons on the page, these are all driven by a combination of the person's ability to process information and language and their outcomes and goals, being able to have important information easily accessible. So what will the home page be? It needs to be something that works across contexts and allows them to access the most frequently used vocabulary And I'm going to show you some examples later of users, and you'll see how each person is a little bit different. The number and location of icons on the page will be determined by the person's visual issues, attention, distractibility, cognition in general, and language, their ability to process that much information. The pre-programmed users for aphasia often have 12 to 16 buttons per page, but some software has adjustable grid size, or you can create a template if you feel like this is too many or too few. Typically, it's best to start with the grid size that you want to stick with long term and just hide buttons so that you're working, you're working on memory, motor memory and procedural memory as you're teaching the device, and then you can add more buttons in, you can unhide them so it shows more information. In terms of, these are common content features. So the organization and the page you choose as a home page and how many features you have visible are driven by their language, their cognition, their preferences, their priority of content. So some people might just have topics or context, and that's all that the person can get to. That might be really appropriate for somebody with who's an emergent communicator, or they might have quick fires and topics and context. Somebody who has a little bit more of semantic strength and semantic organization, having vocabulary available would be helpful. Photo albums or stories. I have one client that I'll show you later. Pretty much after we initially started working with him, this is what we used for him to be able to tell stories. And now he's gone beyond that, and we need to start kind of adding some other components in, and we will do that. So visual and linguistic presentation, we got to look at photos, icons, text, dynamic, moving icons essentially, the button color. These are all ways that the buttons or the information is presented for them to make the association with the language that's underlying the button. And based on what you know about language for that person, that is what's going to drive these things. So during an assessment, I try to have multiple setups represented so that I get a sense of what works. You all may not have the capability to do assessments, and you may just be picking up people after they come from assessment centers. So I'm sorry, the device may have already been chosen and the user set up. Although I will tell you that and as an example, one of the people who we use later, when they initially got their device, it was on a sentence structure based user, and that was not a good fit for them. Someone else made a different recommendation, and I was the third person they came to, and we have just kind of gone with that second recommendation. So things can change, and I think it's okay if you are working with the family and with the person and have good rationale for why things need to change to do that. You can have a photo of an object or an action, but from research we know that photos with people using an object or doing an activity, so activity engaged photos, work better than camera engaged photos where somebody's just looking at the camera or where you've just got a cup sitting in front of the camera, because they provide more context, right? Someone drinking from a cup gives you more context than just the cup itself. In terms of icons, the more salient, the better, typically. And text, I often will pair a single word or sometimes a phrase with an icon for somebody with aphasia. Even if they're not, if literacy is not a strength, I will pair a word just because I think it helps support literacy. And I can do that with either, I can put a word with either a photo or an icon. Dynamic movement within icons, I haven't used that a lot, but I think it can help, especially if somebody has some attention difficulties. I did have a student suggest in my class using short videos, and I haven't done that, but I think that would be a good idea. And button color can help with grouping concepts, but for an assessment, I'll typically color like yes, no. Yes will be green and no will be red. I also like color buttons that link. I'll have a certain color. Sometimes in stories, and you'll see an example of this later, opinions will be blue and statements will be white. So just making the background color different. It can help with other semantic organization. questions can be one color, statements another, opinions another, or they can be supportive if somebody has visual impairment because they can provide contrast. Each device has many ways to adjust input, output, auditory, and visual presentation. So you'll want to use all of those and become familiar with them. Okay, so as I get into B's user, and this is the gentleman who is very open to me using his name, and this is who you're going to see in all the videos, which are now not going to work, but that's okay, we'll work through this. We use photos and icons paired with single word text. We find those are the most helpful. He has limited semantic organization, so we've really had to do over the years, and I've been working with him for about 4 years. We've had to do a lot of rearrangement and changing things around based on what we figure out works. And his wife is really good about sharing this with us. He has a strong desire to communicate. He has participation focused. His topics of interest include travel, geography, farming, family, music, and Lawrence, Kansas. He uses a NovaChat 8. He calls it Tabby. It's a 20-button grid. And we have changed this over time. I would consider him a context-dependent communicator, but that changes as time goes on. This is the person who, when they got their device, it was recommended that he use a word power 25 user, which is essentially a sentence construction user. And again, I have not had good success with that with people with aphasia. So he went to Northwestern University. Before I ever saw him, he went there for an intensive intervention in the summer. And they recommended that they change to a basic grid. So they switched to that grid and incorporated buttons from different users. Essentially, they created their own user with just a blank grid. And then we have continued to adjust and add to based on that. This was a video of Bob showing his Tabby to his clinician and kind of going through it, introducing himself. There are some things that he's very familiar with using the device, introducing himself. Now he's finding his children independently. And we've just started telepractice this summer, and we're finding that he's struggling a little bit more because it's a new context, but I'm hopeful that that's going to also help him to expand his use of the device.
So in your sentences, what do we have? I want to get familiar with Tabby since I haven't seen her.
And stretch. And
I want to walk on the stairs.
Like to walk, okay.
in
The stairs.
I need to stretch.
it is stretch.
You need to stretch.
Yes. Just a minute.
Just a second.
Just a second.
It is raining.
It is raining and it's hurting
My arm hurts.
and it's
My leg hurts.
and
It's too easy.
or too hard
It's too hard.
or
I'm thirsty.
I'm thirsty and
Joy is coming.
something.
We use these a lot at the hospital
Yes.
where I'm dropping him off and he needs to communicate with the
Please
therapist.
bring the car.
This is an example so in 2017, this was his homepage. And then in 2018, this was his homepage. So you notice we got rid of some things. We consolidated some things. The actions, we found that he really wasn't using at all. We took stories and put a little icon with them and changed the color. He had who calendar for time, and calendar wasn't working, so we changed that to when and moved it away from who because the WH was confusing to him. So again, this has changed a lot over time, and his new first page user now has all the icons full here, and I don't remember what is on these three, but we have just over time changed. I think one of them is news. News we brought back. It was on the first one and we took it off. And so anyway, we've continued to collaborate with them and just change as we needed. So this is his About Me page. These are things that he likes to talk about with himself, about himself to other people. He's very social, and you can see all of these that have an arrow go to another page. So he has a lot more information on the Peace Corps. He has more information on his children, which also, if I go back, we went to his Who page, you could also click family and then it has kids. So there's multiple ways to get to different pages. And we found that has been helpful for him. This is his farm page. He is a farmer and they run a farm. So this has been very helpful for him to have these things. And we've since added, because they do organic farming and grow soybeans for tofu. So that was something that it's a very specific thing that he likes to share, and nobody would ever guess it by doing clarifying questions. So that has been helpful. This is his who page, and it has family, therapist, friend, and there's actually several more. One now is siblings, another is extended family, I think, or nieces and nephews. And he has two groups. He goes to a group at KU and he goes to a group at our local hospital. And so the people associated with those groups are under these buttons. Then his family goes here. And we have siblings from the main page as well. They're also here in case he goes deeper and wants to also come back and talk about siblings. If he clicks on children, it goes to his children. His children then, each of his children have a page that go to their children, so we can get to his grandchildren in multiple ways. But you can see, I mean, we just set it up so that he can easily find things, and maybe there are multiple pathways to get to them. So again, his child Chris, this goes to his page. It talks about what Chris does. It talks about Chris's wife, Chris's family, where he lives, et cetera, et cetera. On the group page, he has the people that are in the group and the clinicians, which change every semester. News, he has, so originally what we had was a button on the group, on each group page, and he would share news. When he came to the group, he would open up the group page, and so everything was from this page. But what we found out is his wife noticed that he really wasn't using the news page, or they needed the information in more than one spot. So what we did, what she did, and she's doing a lot of the programming, and that has been a burden on her. So we're trying to relieve some of that burden currently. But instead of doing it within this page, she created a news page. So he does have to toggle back. He has to go back, and then he can hit news. And this is his current news, and things change. We no longer have people on there. The world, this is one of his favorite pages. So if he opens up maps, and his wife took a lot of time, she programmed all of these maps. Some of these come pre-programmed, but when you open these up and you touch a certain place in them, it will say the name of the state. But she went in, because he was from Long Island, and programmed maps of Long Island and specific things. This is where I grew up. This is the beach that I used to do this at. So he could really talk about things related to where he's traveled and where he's been. And he uses these all the time. He can get to these pages independently because they're very meaningful for him. When, again, we changed this from time and calendar and changed it to when, and that has seemed to be effective. He still does need prompts to get to when. Those WH concepts are really hard. Who he has now, but when is a little bit harder. Tell joy. So that was his user, and now I'm going to contrast that with a little bit different user, and I'm going to try to move quicker here. So this young man used a NovaChat communication journey aphasia as a template. He had high contrast icons with bolded text and photos because he had visual cortical impairment post-head injury. Direct access was triggered on release, so instead of touching the button, because he had ataxia and tremors in his hand, we wanted it to activate when he released it. So we did that. We kept things in a consistent location when possible because his memory was impaired. Language was strong, but memory was impaired. Speech was non-functional. He had fewer buttons spread out about on the same grid, and he had binary choices if needed. He was an emergent communicator, and here were some of his interests. And I'm going to show you some of his pages and explain a little bit more. So this was his home page, so it's a little bit more simplified. This was his timeline, so he could talk about him and what had happened in his life. And this is kind of another example of a visual scene. We had set things up so that, like, from his main page, he could do I need, and it would go to a page that had basic needs. And if he chose a drink, then it would come up with yes or no, because he had so many errors that he would get frustrated. Like if he chose I want a drink and that really wasn't what he wanted, here this gave him the option to say no, that was an error. Now he got better at using the device, but because of his tremors, we wanted to keep this in place. So if he hit yes, it would then go to the choices for the drink. If he hit no, it would go back to the I want page. We used icons with him versus photos because he didn't have good visual clarity. So that was one reason we wanted to use icons. He loved sports. What we did was program in fight songs for all of these schools, and put some rosters underneath these, which he couldn't really see, but someone would have to read them to him. So that was a problem. It would have been nice if we could have had a verbal list. We had sports talk, where if they were watching a game or something, he could make comments. And we had scales. So under scales, there were different types of scales. Things are difficult or easy. What level are they? And he used those when he was prompted to, pretty much. So P's user was a compass on an iPad. We used the stroke and brain injury persona. He is now ready to move to a different user. Initially, he was really he was very much an emergent communicator. And we really just used 9 buttons to get his primary needs across. But what we found was he was much more motivated when we went into the photo album and put in stories. He's a history buff, so he could tell us about stories and about himself and about things that he knows about. And that's what has motivated him to use the device. His wife at one point asked us to put in information so he could express his opinion on them putting a building in downtown in Lawrence. And he went to the city commission meeting and did that. And that was really awesome. But these are examples of what, and again, this is pretty much all he uses right now. And again, we're ready to move to a different user, and we're going to expand it for him. But so these are stories of, this is about a building that he owns and a store that he owns. This is about Quantrell's raid, and you click on this and it goes to more detailed information. This photo albums is how we get to this. Okay, so we're not really in the communication user, we're just in the photo albums. But when he clicks on Quantrell's raid, it comes up with photos that we've added and different comments about those photos. And then this is where, what I mentioned earlier, where we have his opinions instead of just statements. So let me get to teaching strategies. I'm going to have to move through these fairly quickly. These are not all inclusive by any means. There are lots of teaching strategies that we can use, but we want to maximize the use of motor memory whenever possible. So we want to do repetition, but we want to do it in context, and we want to do it across context. So we use a lot of modeling and aided input and self-talk. And there are some links on here that you can go and actually see, like this link will take you to an example of an adult with a developmental disorder and a clinician using modeling with him. So with modeling, the clinician models use in tasks and with functional use. So we're leveling the playing field by using the same language system as they use. Sometimes in our sessions, we'll each have a device. The clinician has a device and they have a device. It's the same user, so we're doing the same thing, but they can see the clinician using it, and the clinician is using it in activities. So you're using the AAC system to communicate, and that helps you get comfortable with it. Maybe the spouse or the care provider's using it. And you can pair modeling with self-talk to help them identify how you made the navigation choices. You want to do this simply. I mean, you guys know that from working with people with aphasia. And after you model, the expectation is that they complete the sequence of touches. They may need more support to do that by you kind of pointing to it with a pen, the button that you want them to push.
No.
Maybe, I mean, sure, but no.
I'm thinking.
I think so. What now?
We have 2 girls.
Yes.
2. Family.
Oh, it is.
Baby.
Baby is. Yes.
3.
This was a great example of modeling. So aided input is modeling with expansion using the device. So for example, they touch I'm hungry, either spontaneously or with support. And then you can say, you're hungry, touching I'm hungry. So I would be touching I'm hungry. And then I might say, it's about dinner time while I touch the dinner button. So that's kind of expanding what they're using. And that's kind of what aided input is. You could then continue the conversation and model more by touching dinner and saying, my husband's making dinner tonight. I hope he makes, and then because under the dinner button, there might be different foods. So I could choose what I wanted him to make or what I was hoping he was making. And again, this is another example you can find on YouTube. The examples are not of people with aphasia, but you get the idea of what it is. So self-talk and thinking out loud, you can pair with modeling and aided input. So for example, I'm looking for Target. Target's a place, so I touch places, and I say Target's a place and touch it. It's a type of store, touching store, and I recognize the big Target symbol. And I can use this kind of narration, even if I'm not sure where something is, I can use that, and that demonstrates that there's this problem solving that goes through, oh, I thought it would be here. Nope, it's not here. Let's go back and try a different pathway.
Coat or jacket?
Yes.
What color is her jacket?
It's green. No. Brown.
We could go to describe and look at our colors.
Yes.
Home. Describe. Colors are describing. Yes. Yep. Colors.
Colors.
What color is her coat?
Maybe
Some of both. I think it's more pink.
pink.
Red.
No.
I'm thinking
I don't know.
Colors.
Pink.
Pink.
Pink maybe.
Direct instruction is often key. I mean, I use this is what I use primarily with adults, providing explicit instruction on how to do something, keeping it simple, and providing a rationale. Why are we doing this? This is important because, and I do this both with the clients and their partners or the communication partners. This is a prompted hierarchy. Katie Ahern developed this, and this was developed for use with kids. It's here for your access. You can also find it online. I will just mention, when people use it with kids, oftentimes they're going from least support to most support. But what I find when I'm working with people with aphasia is I'm starting with most support and working up and trying to lessen the support. So I give models, I give direct instruction, then I try just doing verbal cues and then just gestural cues. So I'm trying to lessen the support as I go, but I start with lots of support because it's learning a new language. So some of the things that I do in intervention that can, in some ways, this is somewhat similar to like a traditional intervention approach. I use an icon map. So I create the icons that I want them to find and I put them in a row, kind of like you see here, and I might cut them in strips. It's a different level of support. They have this to look at. He clicks Bob, goes back, everyday phrases, I'm thinking. It allows practice at home for some, not everybody. It's a good method to work on motor memory because they get that repeated practice. It allows you to focus on functional use and let the motor memory practice happen at some level outside of intervention. And it helps partners learn the routes as well, because oftentimes partners, especially initially, are helping them at home. You want to make sure that they can be successful with this, kind of like with speech or artic therapy. You want to make sure they can produce the sound correctly. You want to make sure that if we're looking for this son, that he is able in therapy to follow this map. He goes to who, family, children, and Ashton.
Food.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
Food.
So find
Oh, yeah.
Food.
Coffee.
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 Let's find coffee 2 more times.
Okay.
Food. Coffee.
Coffee.
Food. Coffee.
Coffee.
I will, this,
Maybe.
You think
Yeah.
they're
Oh yes.
sisters?
Oh yes.
Yeah, sisters. We could find sisters on your device.
Okay.
Tabby. Who?
Who?
Talking about people? Who? Mm-hmm. This would be family.
Family.
Yep.
Sophie.
And and maybe. Well, yes.
the example that I had with the icon map, actually from one semester, one semester I did a presentation, and that video that I was going to show you was from the previous semester. And in that one semester, he had gone from needing extra time and lots of prompts to just doing it spontaneously when asked. Like when shown, go to this icon, he could do it. So there was this huge change that we were able to see with that video. Sometimes, in addition to icon map practice, finding a message or icon with or without maps, verbal practice of words or phrases on the device. So a lot of times clients will use the device to practice. I want to make sure they know when they get the device, that's not the purpose of it, but they can practice with it, and it can be very functional and very helpful for that. Especially just for learning where things are and saying the words. So these are some examples. Circle the word that doesn't belong in the group. We might do this in therapy, and then we might write on here the category, right? So countries, and we might put the icon map here with it so he can go home and find these. Sorting. Cutting all of these up and having them sort them into categories can help increase categorization. And again, when we're doing it in therapy, we're having them do it, but then also find the item on their device. So it's just that repeated practice. I guess, and you can, when I was in the hospital, I did a lot of traditional therapy through AAC. A lot of the things that I would do just verbally, I did verbally, but I also used the AAC to help with that. So I think the one thing I would want to leave you with is that supporting somebody with aphasia as they learn to use it successfully is a journey to use an AAC device. Each of you have the ability to do it. You have to identify what aspects of AAC make you uncomfortable and begin growing yourself there. And then remember that it's not just the client, but the communication partner that are critical. I would take, I've got a bunch of references for you, and I apologize that the videos didn't work. We would have run out of time, but the videos are very helpful, and I apologize for that. I can take some questions or.
So we really haven't had too many questions,
Okay.
But if anybody types anything in, we can always address those.
Okay.
I think that when we do the recording as well, when I edit this, if you send me those recordings, I can embed them so that
Okay.
the final product, it would have that.
That would be super. Okay, I can do that. Yeah, I will do that. Anything else?
It doesn't look like there's any questions. Oh. So there's one second. It says, have you used in motor planning communication, I think.
So you're referring to like the PRC devices that the focus is incorporating the motor planning to help support the language. Okay. I don't necessarily do that from the sense of like when you're doing that, you're typically teaching kids language. And so you're getting that motor planning incorporated as they learn the language. But I do try to keep things kind of in the same place. So home is always in the same place on a page, regardless of the page, and go back is always on the same place. And I try to, we try not to, once we get a system established, we try not to move those major buttons, because once we do some of that practice with repetition and home activities and functional activities, then the motor planning has come into play. So I think it comes into play, but it's not, I'm not focusing on it as much as we would like if we were working with kids and teaching them language and doing sentence construction language type things.
Okay. She responded, that makes sense. She has one more question. Do you have any thoughts or ideas for working with people, PWA, people with
aphasia?
Oh, sorry, I'm doing
That's okay.
PUA, struggling with depression. I feel like I often see people with aphasia who don't follow through with AAC, and I wonder how much depression and lost expectations play into it.
Yeah,
that affects.
You know, and I think that's huge. And that's why I try to really focus on the participation and have them and their care providers establish for me what are the priorities that they want to do, because that's what we want to get first. Like this gentleman who wanted to present at the city commission meeting, that was really important for him. And I will say, I have a daughter who's a clinical social worker, and so we have discussed how people who have difficulty communicating really could benefit from therapy, but it's hard because nobody can really facilitate that process well, right? So yes, I do see that.
Okay, and then we'll do this last question. How many of your clients with aphasia independently use keyboards?
Very few of the folks with aphasia use keyboards independently, for sure. Some of them use them to supplement, and like especially, I don't have a lot of folks right now with Broca's aphasia, but over the years I've had several people with Broca's aphasia, and they, I think, have more success getting the keyboard use down, especially getting at least the first few letters and then being able to use the word prediction. Certainly the people I work with traumatic brain injury who have more intact language, they use the keyboards a lot and word prediction. But usually the people with aphasia, I just have not had good success with them using keyboards. We are working right now with somebody, with the gentleman that you see in this video and another person. They're working using their keyboard in different ways. So the gentleman will try to write words, and so we're trying to get him to use the keyboard and then look for the word prediction, and that's somewhat successful. Again, that's 3 or 4 years into the process that we're doing that. Another person we're working with is just kind of matching letters to spell, because she really has no literacy skills at all. So we're still using the keyboard, but not necessarily for terribly functional communication at this point.
Okay, and then one more curious one about, have you ever found the word power programs to be successful with PWA, such as the higher level patients who can read pretty well?
So I have one person who came to me and is using word power, but we have really individualized the word power. We don't use the core words. I have not had a lot of success with like the core words and sentence construction, but the one gal I have right now that uses word power, again, she's able to tolerate a lot of buttons on a page, and so it's still more semantically organized and context organized, but we do have some single word vocabulary, and I mean, she could always access the core. We don't have it pop up, and we haven't been working with that.
Thank you so much, Julie, for presenting to us today.
You bet. It was my pleasure. And feel free to contact me if you have any questions. My email is jgatts@ku.edu.